Over the past few days, there have been many protests in cities throughout the UK under the banner of "Enough is enough." Their goals have been clearly stated and expressed. The protesters are calling for a real pay rise, for energy bills to be slashed, for an end to food poverty, for decent housing for all, and for greater taxation on the wealthy. Debates over the cost of living crisis are, of course, endless. Economists have argued back and forth over whether Liz Truss's plan to grow the economy through tax cuts will have the desired impact, or whether they'll just benefit those with the most money. These protesters clearly take the view that the government's approach will be catastrophic. Some of the placards make it clear that some of those in attendance absolutely hate this government and would like to see it collapse. And so it's reassuring that they are able to express that view, because we live in a free country and the hallmark of a functioning and healthy democracy is the right to peaceful protest. And whenever I see peaceful protests, irrespective of whether I agree with the protesters or not, I am reassured, because it means that for all the threats to free speech we currently face, we're still holding on to the right to assemble. This is also why I've been such a vocal opponent of the government's Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, which was published in March last year. Now, this bill puts the onus on police to determine whether or not a protest should be allowed to go ahead, and even says that protests should be banned for being too loud or causing serious annoyance. Too loud? Protests are often loud. It's very difficult to tiptoe when you're carrying a placard. And what does serious annoyance mean? Protests will always annoy someone, otherwise there'd be no point. The language of this bill is hopelessly vague and open to exploitation. If the noise from a peaceful protest is deemed to have relevant impact on other citizens that may be significant, it could be shut down under this new law. And who gets to decide what's significant? Well, the Home Office. But what if the subject of the protest is the government itself? Surely there could be a conflict of interest there. Now, recently we saw anti-monarchist protesters arrested for holding up signs saying "Not my king." At least one of those arrests took place under the auspices of the new Police Crime and Sentencing Bill. And while the strength of feeling at the time of the Queen's death is understandable, the erosion of civil liberties can never be excused. The way we deal with those we find intolerant is through criticism, ridicule, sometimes counter-protest. Well, once you start supporting the state, arresting those you disagree with, you're setting a really dangerous precedent that could very well one day be used against the causes that you support. To give a concrete example of this, after what became known as the Battle of Cable Street on 4th of October 1936, where Oswald Molesley's black shirts were intercepted by anti-fascist demonstrators as they attempted to march through the East End of London, the Labour Party was instrumental in urging Parliament to rush through public order legislation to stop further uprisings by the far right. And yet, since their inception, these measures have mostly been used to crack down on left-wing activism. And in fact, they formed the basis of the government's justification to arrest striking miners in the mid-1980s. And the lesson ought to be clear. If you grant the state the powers to restrict freedom of assembly and freedom of speech, you won't be able to predict how such powers are exploited in the future. And the same goes for hate speech laws. In 2012, the European Court of Human Rights concluded there is no universally accepted definition of the expression hate speech. And a manual published by UNESCO in 2015 accepted that the possibility of reaching a universally shared definition seems unlikely. And if you look at the various hate speech laws across Europe, it's clear that no one knows how it ought to be defined. As a result, you end up with people being arrested for jokes, or for quoting rap lyrics, or for retweeting memes. These laws are really dangerous, and they ought to be scrapped. But of course, our current government is pushing through their online safety bill, which is only going to make matters worse. So why did the government feel the need to crack down on protests? Well, partly it was because of a worrying trend that has escalated over the past few years. People have started to excuse violent protests because they are convinced that their cause is so righteous that anything can be justified. We've had environmental activists who have started to cause criminal damage. In last year, March, there were 3 members of Extinction Rebellion prosecuted for vandalising a number of buildings at Cambridge University. In September last year, activists from the group smashed windows at the headquarters of JP Morgan with hammers that were decorated with the words "live, laugh and love," because, of course, the most effective way of demonstrating love is with hammers. And we've also seen trans rights activists sending death threats and physically assaulting feminist protesters. Many of the Black Lives Matter protests in America turned violent, with politicians even making excuses for those who committed acts of violence. But all such activities undermine the protesters' cause. It should be really simple. We should support all forms of peaceful protest, whether we agree with the protesters' aims or not, and we should condemn all sorts of violent protests, whether we agree with the protesters' aims or not. And we shouldn't take these rights for granted. Do you think the equivalent of the enough is enough protests could happen in Iran? Look at the anti-government protests that are happening there right now. Soldiers and police have been instructed to severely confront these protesters, not the most subtle of euphemisms. And at least 52 people have been killed. This all started when 22-year-old Mahsa Amini was arrested by the morality police for not wearing a hijab. And her treatment at the hands of the authorities led to her death in custody. And in the wake of this atrocity, women have been taken to the streets to protest being treated as second-class citizens. Whereas in the West, some intersectional feminists promote wearing the veil as empowering, in theocracies like Iran, women understand that the garment is a means of misogynistic oppression. And the bravery of these protesters is unimaginable. Women have been putting their lives at risk, burning their veils publicly and dancing, all of which is, of course, forbidden by the religious authorities. And now, women in Afghanistan have taken to the streets in a show of solidarity. One Iranian journalist who filmed the protest asked one of the women if she should blur her face in the reporting. No, she replied. The Taliban blurs our face. We want to take our visibility back. Incredible courage. So whatever you think of the protests against the Tory government that have happened this weekend, remember that to live in a society in which peaceful protests are possible is a wonderful thing. Throughout history, one of the first rights that tyrants restrict is the right to protest. And we need to be wary of anyone who would like to see that happen here.